Hey guys, and welcome to MTGHQ. My name is Sean, and I'm going to be running through my Athreos EDH deck today. Now, just before we start, I did want to mention that I have seen some people talking about they want to see budget EDH decks, they want to see decks that they can afford to play, and so on and so forth. Now, I have a couple of solutions for you guys. First off, when it comes to building an EDH deck that is competitive, fun to play, and cheap, as you can imagine, that's actually really difficult to do. I will try my best in the future to do this for you after this deck, but I can't always promise that I'm going to be able to do that for you. I do know for a fact, though, as a lot of my friends, myself included in some instances, have bought, say, like a pre-con EDH deck that Magic pumps out, and those can run you about 40 bucks or something like that. That is relatively cheap as far as I'm concerned, and they are playable decks. So if you were to pick up one of those, and then if you come and watch my videos, or Alex's videos, or Jeremy's videos, and you see cards that are like, hey, I didn't know that that existed, I really want to use that in my deck, well, that's something that you can work on then. So you have set 100 cards in your pre-con, and you see one card that you really like, well, then you can figure out a way to trade up to that card potentially, and then slot that in as soon as you get it after you take something out. Another thing that a lot of my friends do, that I have actually encouraged for just our play group, is to use proxied cards. Now, generally, as a proxied card, I know they're a little bit of a taboo thing, but for us, it's a piece of paper which has the card on it. It's clearly a proxy. There's no way that you're going to try and ever say that it's a real card. You're not going to try to give it to somebody. You're not going to try to sell it, trade it, or anything like that. That's completely unethical. It's completely wrong to do. The only reason we use proxies is to test out decks and make sure that we want this deck before we actually go ahead and throw all the money that we have at it. As you can see, some of our EDH decks are a little bit more on the expensive side. So we want to typically test these decks and play them for a while with proxied cards before we decide to go ahead and spend the $1,000 or spend the $500 or whatever it takes to actually build something. So in this deck today that I'm going to be showing you, there are a couple of proxies in there. Now, you're typically going to be able to tell when it is a proxy. It's just a piece of paper that I printed off a card. I slid it in front of like a basic land inside of a sleeve, and that's how I'm going to be playing with it today. It's a cheap way to make the deck, and not only that, but EDH, if you're going to be playing casually, it's perfectly acceptable to use these kinds of cards, especially if you're only going to be playing with your friends. Now, with that being said, I can get on with the deck list. Like I said, Athreos is going to be our general. Sorry, I kind of slid him off the camera a little bit early there. He's a 3-drop, 1 colorless, 1 white, 1 black, for a 5/4 indestructible enchantment creature, which is a god. As long as your devotion to black and white is less than 7, he isn't a creature, which, you know, kind of sucks sometimes, but we usually get enough permanents out of the field to make him a creature. And whenever another creature you own dies, not just control, it's own. So if somebody else took it, then that one actually counts. You can return that card to your hand unless target opponent pays 3 life. So you get to pick who that is. Say someone is at 3 life exactly. You can choose them for every single trigger that you ever have with Athreos. Or say someone has a Platinum Empyrean out there and they can't pay life. You can choose them, and as long as you choose them, they can't pay 3, you can put that card back in your hand, if that's what you want to do. Sometimes we actually want creatures to hit the graveyard for effects. Sometimes we want them to stay there, and we'll bring them back later for all intensive purposes. It's going to be up to what is going on currently in the game, whether or not you want that card back in your hand. So, first off, we're going to talk about our lands. Now, to cut down on a little bit of time here, I'm just going to tell you right now, I run 36 lands in every single EDH deck that I build. Now, sometimes I run a couple of really good utility lands that are almost essential to have in the deck that you're playing, so I'll talk about those more than I will about the others. So right now we have 33 lands that are either black or white or a combination of both, and they're just meant to get us our colors. Now, you keep in mind whenever you're building a multicolor EDH deck, you want to make sure you're going to be able to get your colors. So you don't want to have too many colorless producing lands in any given deck. So out of my deck, I only chose these 3 to show you guys. I have an Urborg, a Rogue's Passage, and a Reliquary Tower. Now, Urborg by itself, technically you can count it as a swamp even though it doesn't say swamp on it, but when it comes into play, each other land is a swamp. Your lands, your opponent's lands, everybody's lands are now swamps. Rogue's Passage, you can tap it for a colorless, or for 4 and tap it, target creature can't be blocked. And then Reliquary Tower, just an overall staple I have come to find in EDH to make it sure that you have an unlimited hand size. Next, we're going to be talking about my instant spells in the deck. Now, I'm pretty sure every single type of card that I am going to be talking about today has been listed by mana cost, so we're going to try and deal with that as we go. First up, we're going to talk about a pair called Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares. They essentially do the same thing. Path gives them a land, while Swords to Plowshares lets them gain a little bit of life. But it's just targeted 1 white creature removal spell. Pretty good to have, especially having 2 of them, because you never know when that turn 1 ungodly creature hits the field and you're going to need something to remove it before it starts aiming your way. Next 1-drop is going to be Enlightened Tutor. You can search your library for an artifact or enchantment card, reveal that card to all players, and then shuffle your library and put it on top. Just like most traditional 1-drop tutors, it's going to be putting on the top of your library, but that's not usually a bad problem. You can do this right before your turn, and then you draw it right away anyway. Next is going to be Mortify. Now, I know, why not play Anguished Unmaking? Well, in truth, I'm actually wanting to play Anguished Unmaking. I just haven't gotten one yet. I have one on the way. It's the promo version, which is what I wanted. That will be taking the spot of Mortify the second I get it. But for right now, that's what's in the deck. Next is going to be Utter End. Again, promo version, like I've had it in a couple of other EDH decks of mine. Just love how it looks, and it exiles target non-land permanent. You can't ask for more. And last for the instance is going to be Return to Dust. Exile target artifact or enchantment. You can if you cast a spell during your main phase, you can exile up to 1 more target artifact or enchantment. So for 4, get rid of 2 things that are bugging you from your opponent's board that are artifacts and enchantments. Pretty hard to say no to that. Next, we're going to go through my artifacts. We're going to go with, we're going to start out here with Soul Ring. Again, another thing that a lot of people have just found it as a staple to run. I don't always run it, but most of the time I do. It's hard to say no to 1 colorless for 2 colorless. Lightning Greaves is the only equipment I'm going to run of that sort. I don't run Swiftfoot Boots in this deck because I've found Lightning Greaves is usually just enough. Thought Vessel, another way to get a no maximum hand size, and it also produces 1 colorless, so it has a little bit of an added benefit there. It doesn't just sit there and say no maximum hand size. Orzhov Signet for a little bit more, it's not necessarily ramp. I mean, you know, for 2 mana, you're going to get something that can produce 1, essentially, but it does produce colors. So if you happen to have gotten your colorless lands in this deck, this way you can at least produce some color with it. Altar of Dementia, we're going to get into why I'm running this a little bit later, but it's a sack outlet. So whenever you sacrifice a creature, sorry, not whenever, it's if you sacrifice a creature to Altar of Dementia, target player puts a number of cards equal to that creature's power from the top of his or library into the graveyard. So they're going to mill that much. You're going to find in this deck that I'm actually running that sack outlet is actually pretty important. This deck is really synergistic. It's not exactly super competitive. It's not infinite combo, but a lot of these cards work together to do one purpose. Ashnod's Altar, essentially there for the same thing. It's going to add 2 colorless mana to my mana pool if I sack it using Ashnod's Altar. Burnished Heart, another way to mana ramp a little bit because mana is usually really important in EDH, and especially seeming how I'm going to have a lot of expensive cards in here, especially expensive creatures. I want to play them as soon as possible. So for this guy, pay him for 3. Following turn, I can tap 3, or actually that turn if I happen to have the mana. But typically, I'm going to be playing this on turn 3, and then on turn 4, I'm going to sack it, go grab 2 basics, and put them into play. If I happen to have an Athreos out with this guy, though, I can make people pay 3. Otherwise, I can just continuously do it. And I found a lot of people don't typically want to pay for the Burnished Heart, even though they don't understand that I'm ramping with this guy. Next is Whip of Erebos. Really cool combo that I have to show you with this guy later. But 4-drop. Your creatures have lifelink, and for 4, tap it, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, or if it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate this ability only every time you could, only a time that you could cast a sorcery. And then last is going to be Eldrazi Monument. 5-drop, creatures you control have +1/+1, flying and indestructible. At the beginning of your upkeep, sack a creature. If you can't, sack Eldrazi Monument. So, that being said, we're going to carry on for the sorceries now. Demonic Tutor, self-explanatory. 2 mana, go grab a card, put it in your hand. Black Suns. We're going to do X, 2 black, put X -1/-1 counters on each creature, and then shuffle Black Suns back in. Now, foreshadowing here, there are a lot of board wipes in this deck. And if you can't tell, it's the reason that there are so many is because I'm running Athreos. I really don't care about my creatures dying because my opponents are going to have to pay a lot of life in order to keep my creatures back in the graveyard. So me wiping the board constantly is one of those things that this deck is actually okay with. Exsanguinate is X2 black, each opponent loses X life, and you gain that much. So if you happen to have any amount of mana out on the field that's greater than 5, you're going to be gaining a whole bunch of life that's kind of hard for your opponents to come back from. Toxic Deluge, for those times where you have indestructible creatures out there. As an additional cost to play the Toxic Deluge, you pay X life, and then all creatures get -X till the end of turn. Immortal Servitude for X, and then 3 hybrid of black or white. Return each creature card with converted mana cost of X from your graveyard to the battlefield. Just a simple recursion spell. Next is Day of Judgment that I happen to have. It's the worst version of Wrath of God. Costs the same, but it doesn't have the creatures can't regenerate this turn. And speaking of which, the next card is Wrath of God. Like I said, it's the same exact thing, except they can't be regenerated. Mutilate is 4-drop board wipe. All creatures get -1/-1 till the end of turn for each swamp you control. So you need to get quite a few swamps to get some of the stronger creatures out there, but you can, generally, when you cast this, you can clear the board of at least quite a bit out there. Another card I have found that's been pretty important to play has been End Hostilities. Now, it doesn't look like that great of a board wipe. However, in EDH, it ends up being quite useful. If your opponents are, say, using a bunch of equipment that you don't like, well, this is going to pop all of those permanents on that creature as well. So all of those equipments you didn't like, it's going to get rid of all those equipments. All those enchantments, it's going to get rid of all of those as well, not just the creature. But the other cool thing about it is that it has a 5 mana cost, so it can get around things such as the card You Can't Even, Void Winnower. It's hard to say no to a board wipe that can get rid of Void Winnower. Following up is another 5-drop board wipe, which is Rout. And you can play it any time that you could play an instant as long as you pay 2 or more. Or as long as you pay 2 more colorless when you cast it. And again, it has Destroy All Creatures, and just like Wrath of God, they can't be regenerated. Another 5-drop is Unburial Rites. Pretty useful card to have. And for 5 mana, return target creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield, and you can flash it back for 4. Merciless Eviction, another way to clear the board, just except instead of destroy, it's exile everything. So it again gets around the indestructible effects that your opponents may have. However, you can only choose either artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or planeswalkers. So you get to choose out of any of those modes, which sometimes you may not always want to choose creatures, so it's also helpful in that regard. And the last one for the sorceries is Planar Cleansing. Another great board wipe to have, gets rid of all non-land permanents. So say you don't have that much going on your board, your opponents are stacking up with non-creature permanents, you want to clear the board, especially of those particular permanents along with the creatures, well, Planar Cleansing is the way to do that. Moving on to the enchantments, we're going to first start off with Grasp of Fate, which is essentially an Oblivion Ring for each of your opponents. You get to take one of their permanents and exile it underneath Grasp of Fate. When Grasp of Fate leaves, they get those permanents back, but as long as you can protect it, then you're at least getting rid of some problems for the time being. Phyrexian Arena, hard not to run it. 3-drop. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Yeah, you're going to lose a little bit of life, but you're going to get that card advantage to win the game a little bit sooner. No Mercy. Whenever a creature successfully deals damage to you, destroy it. Make something a problem only one time, hopefully. Leyline of the Void. Again, really mean card to play in this deck if we're going to be wiping the board constantly on our opponents. If a card would be going to an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you get to exile it instead. Next is Grave Pact. So whenever a creature that you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each other player sacrifices a creature. And next is Dictate of Erebos, which does the same exact thing, except it states each opponent. So it doesn't help your teammates if you happen to be on a team at that given time. And the last for the enchantments is Grave Betrayal. Whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other types. So if you're going to be wiping the board all the time, you might as well get those creatures back on your side. And now we're going to go through the plethora of creatures that I happen to have here. First off is a staple white creature, Serra Ascendant. For 1, you get a 6/6 lifelink at the beginning of your turn if you're playing EDH, because life total start at 40. Aelia the Eternal Pilgrim. Now, I'm running this in this deck because I have a couple of ways to gain life. The deck's not about gaining life, it's about making sure that the board stays as dead as I want it to. But Aelia has been, pretty good as far as another sack outlet for some of my creatures. It has Death Touch, and if I happen to get 10 more life from my starting total, then I can start exiling permanents. Another great thing to be able to do. High Priest of Penance, just another way to pop creatures. If they're attacking at me, the second that High Priest is dealt damage, I get to destroy target non-land permanent. Blood Artist. Pretty good when I'm going to be clearing the board all the time. Whenever a Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and I gain 1 life. Uzumi Grave Robber is kind of a cool, flip card that I run sometime. It's kind of a cool flip card that's from a set that I can't even remember off the top of my head. Sorry for that. But when it comes into play, it has just this one ability of 1 colorless, 1 black, exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. If no cards are in that graveyard, flip Uzumi Grave Robber. Then it's going to have that additional ability on the flip side, which is for 4 colorless and a black, you can put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That could be your graveyard, your opponent's graveyard, anybody's graveyard, and you're going to be able to just put a creature out. For 5 mana, it's a little bit high, I understand that, but that ability is kind of worth the 5 mana. Next is going to be Zulaport Cutthroat. Does almost a pseudo Blood Artist kind of thing. Whenever Zulaport Cutthroat and another creature I control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and I gain 1 life. Next is Liliana, Heretical Healer. The new origins of Lily. For 3, I have a 2/3 lifelinker. And whenever another non-token creature I control dies, I can exile Liliana the Healer, then return to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. If you do, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token on the battlefield. And just for reference, if you haven't seen it, the flip side for Lily is +2, each player discards a card, -X, return target non-legendary creature card with converted mana cost of X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then -8 is you get an emblem, which is essentially Grave Betrayal. Whenever a creature dies, return to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. Just flip this back around to put it back in the sleeve. Next creature is going to be Merciless Executioner. For 3, you get a 3/1, and whenever it enters the battlefield, each player sacks a creature, including yourself. It's a pseudo Fleshbag Marauder. It does the same thing, has the same power for the same cost, just has a different name. Fiend Hunter. For 1 colorless, 2 white, you get a 1/3. Whenever Fiend Hunter enters the battlefield, you may exile another target creature. And then in a separate ability, it has when Fiend Hunter leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card back to the battlefield under its owner's control. The cool thing about Fiend Hunter, though, is that when it hits the battlefield, that first ability is now on the stack. If you have a way to, you can sacrifice Fiend Hunter before that ability resolves. And if you were to do that, the targeted creature with Fiend Hunter will then be exiled permanently. So it's kind of like 3 exile target permanent exile target creature as long as you have a way to sacrifice Fiend Hunter. Another 3-drop is going to be Mentor of the Meek. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 1 colorless. If you do, draw a card. Pretty useful when we don't have a lot of ways to draw cards in this deck. Grim Haruspex is a 3-drop. Ironically enough, since I said it, it's another way to draw cards. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, draw a card for a 3/2. Now, the last 3-drop is Doomed Necromancer. Now, this is actually kind of an important card for this deck. It's a 3-drop, it's a 2/2, it has black, tap, sacrifice, return target creature card from your graveyard to play. One of my favorite things to do in this deck is to set up a little pseudo combo, and it's not infinite, of course, but it's just a cool thing to do. If I have Whip of Erebos out, and I have Liliana in the graveyard, or Doomed Necromancer in the graveyard, I actually need Lily in the graveyard. I use Whip of Erebos, I tap it, I bring back Liliana. With Liliana on the field, I can sacrifice any creature using my sack outlet on the field that I'll typically have, and then I get to flip Liliana so that she's now a Planeswalker with 3 loyalty counters on her. With those 3 loyalty counters on her, I can -3 her, put her back in the graveyard, and bring back Doom Necromancer. Now remember, your Liliana is not actually getting exiled from Whip of Erebos, because Liliana's text actually states, whenever another creature you control, or whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you exile Liliana and then bring her back transformed. Now, Whip of Erebos only cares that that card's getting exiled. So seeming how it doesn't override the exile that Lily is doing to herself. It's kind of like Obsidian Ghost Council back during the days of your Return to Ravnica standard. So this is an infinite way to be able to keep bringing back Lily and keep bringing back Doom Necromancer, so you can slowly get all of the creature cards back from your graveyard to the battlefield if you so choose. Continuing on with the cards, or with the creature cards, we have Disciple of Volus, 4-drop 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice another creature. You gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the creature's power. Pretty solid way to gain life, way to draw cards, just in case. Ghost Council of Orzhova. For 4, you get a 4/4, and whenever it comes into play, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. For 1 colorless, you can sack a creature and flicker him. He'll come back at the beginning of the he'll come back at the end of the turn. Another 4-drop is going to be Smothering Abomination. It has Devoid, Flying, 4/3. At the beginning of your upkeep, sack a creature. Whenever you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. Now, make sure you note it's whenever you sacrifice a creature, period. Not sacrifice a creature to Smothering Abomination's ability. An essential 4-drop to have in any deck that has a Urborg in it is Cryptghast. It has Extort for 2/2. It has an Extort, and it has whenever you tap a swamp for mana, add black to your mana pool. So your Urborg makes all of your land swamps. So whenever you tap one of those for any color mana, it's going to add a black just for free. Second to last 4-drop is Solemn Simulacrum. When it enters the battlefield, search my library for basic, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And when it dies, I get to draw a card. Pretty cool. Another way to gain some card advantage, another way to gain some life. And again, with Athreos' ability, it's likely that he'll be allowed to go back to my hand and I get to do it all over again. And the last 4-drop is Erebos, God of the Dead. Great way to draw. He's gonna drain me of some life when I'm drawing, but still need to draw cards at some point. But the cool part about Erebos is he makes it so my opponents can't gain life. So even though I'm losing it, it isn't that my opponents are going to gain some and get out of control too much so for me to handle. Moving on to the 5-drops, I have Deathbringer Leash. For 2 and 3 hybrid of black or white, I have a 3/4 with other black creatures I control get +1/+1. Other white creatures I control get +1/+1. And whenever you play a white spell, I can tap target creature. Whenever I play a black spell, I can destroy target creature as long as it's tapped. Another 5-drop is Divinity of Pride. 5 hybrid black or white. It has flying lifelink, and as long as I have 25 or more life, it has +4/+4. So by itself, it's still pretty good. It's a 4/4 flying lifelink. Not hard to say no to that, but as long as you have more life, it has a Serra Ascendant kind of feel to it, where all of a sudden it has a lot more power and it swings for a lot more. Next, we have Mikaeus the Unhallowed. For 3 and 3 black, I have a 5/5 Intimidator. Whenever a human deals damage to me, I get to destroy it. And other non-human creatures I control have +1/+1 and have Undying, which means that if they were to die without a +1/+1 counter on them, they come back with a +1/+1 counter on them. Harvester of Souls is a 6-drop death-touching 5/5, and he helps me out a little bit more with whenever another non-token creature dies, either I control or my opponents control, I get to draw a card. Magister of Worth is a board wipe on a creature. She's a 6-drop for a 4/4, and it has Will of the Council, which means when I play this card, we start to vote, and I get to choose first for either Condemnation or Grace. If Grace gets more votes, then we bring all creature cards from all graveyards back to the battlefields under their owner's control. But if Condemnation has more votes, or if the votes are tied, then all creatures get to be destroyed except for Magister of Worth. Sun Titan, 6-drop 6/6 with Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, I can return target permanent card with converted mana cost of 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. Works great if you want to have some more, if you want to ramp up a little bit more mana. You can grab all of your fetch lands and continue to fetch over and over again with Sun Titan. Or if you want to grab, like I said before, the 3-drop creatures like Lily and Doom Necromancer to start working on that synergistic combo, that would be pretty nice to do as well with Sun Titan. Then we'll have his polar opposite, Grave Titan. For 6, I get a 6/6 Death Toucher, and whenever he attacks or enters the battlefield, I get 2 black zombie creature tokens. 7-drop, have Butcher of Malakir. He's a 5/4 flyer. Whenever he or another creature I control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. It's about the same thing as Dictative Erebos or Grave Pact. It serves the same purpose in this deck. And then lastly, I'm going to be running the 2 creators that I can be running in this deck. First off is going to be Sheoldred, the Whispering one. For 7, I have a 6/6 Swamp Walker, And at the beginning of my upkeep, return target creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they have to sacrifice a creature. And then last is Elish Norn for 7. She's a 4/7 with Vigilance. My creatures get +2/+2. My opponent's creatures get -2/-2. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any suggestions for future EDH decks that you want me to tech, or if you have any questions, you can get at me at @paragon_19 on Twitter, or you can leave comments in the video below. Thank you guys much.
What's up, and thanks for watching this video. I produce all different kinds of content, so if you haven't yet, click on my face to subscribe. If you want to watch more videos, I've got some sweet playlists, including this one, where I open up every fat pack ever created. I've also got this one over here where I open just about anything vintage and old and expensive for your enjoyment. And all this is made possible by the awesome backers at our Patreon, which is linked in the description of every video. Hop on over there, check it out, see if it's something you might want to consider. If not, sit back, enjoy, and I'll still love you.